Today we're talking about something you feel every day, but I bet you never think of it as like a resource. Heat.
Yeah.
Like actual heat. But not just any heat. We're getting into heat networks, which is basically a whole system designed to capture heat that's just wasted. Usually wasted, I guess.
Right, exactly.
And let me tell you, you sent us some wild research on this.
Yeah.
Honestly, some of this stuff had me thinking, wait, seriously?
Yeah, it's a fascinating area, to be honest, especially when you start thinking about where this untapped heat is actually coming from.
Right.
We're talking data centers.
Okay.
Which, as you can imagine, generate a ton of heat.
Just churning away.
Wastewater treatment plants, another big one.
Huh.
And even, get this, disused coal mines.
Wow. I never thought of a coal mine as a source of, well, anything renewable. So we're talking about, what, mining heat?
Yeah.
From these places.
Essentially, yes.
Wild. Okay, but the part that really threw me was the legal stuff.
Yeah.
Like owning heat. That's a thing, right?
You would think so, wouldn't you? But it's actually not that simple. Legally speaking, you can't actually own heat itself.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it's true.
So how does this even, how does anyone make any money from this if you can't own the heat?
Good question. And this is where it gets interesting. It's not about selling the heat directly. It's about selling access to it. Think of it like a wind farm.
Okay, I'm listening.
No one owns the wind.
Right. You can't, bottle it up.
Exactly. But what they do own is the land and the turbines that let them harness its power. It's the same principle here. By selling access to heat rather than the heat itself, it avoids this whole legal gray area of, is heat actually a good under the law, similar to wind?
That's a really good point. So instead of selling the actual heat, you're selling the right to, tap into it.
Precisely.
So does that open up some interesting opportunities then for, whoever controls those heat sources?
Oh, absolutely. The potential for extra revenue streams is definitely there. And it's interesting, one of the sources you sent actually mentioned how some companies are using this to boost their, ESG credentials.
Right. For those of us who don't speak corporate jargon.
Sure.
What are ESG credentials?
Good point. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, which basically boils down to how companies measure their sustainability and how they're impacting the world, socially. So tapping into waste heat is a pretty good way to show, hey, we're thinking about sustainability, which, let's be real, is a big deal for a lot of companies these days.
For sure. Makes sense in today's world. But okay, I got to ask, if we're talking about selling something you can't technically own, how do you even put your price tag on that? What's access to a heat source actually worth?
$1 million question. Literally, that's the challenge right now, figuring out the economics of this whole thing. One idea that keeps coming up is using these, and it sounds more complicated than it is, but risk-sharing models.
Risk sharing. Okay, walk me through that. What does that look like in practice?
So imagine, instead of a fixed price, you have these tiered payments that are based on how much heat the source actually produces. Kind of like some wind farm deals work.
Oh, interesting. So the more heat you provide, the more you could potentially earn.
Exactly.
That makes sense. Seems fair, at least. But before everyone starts measuring the heat output of their home furnace, I have to imagine there are some rules about all this, right? Some regulations.
Oh, you are absolutely right. Regulations are a huge factor here. Can't forget about those.
All right, so let's unpack those then. What kind of rules and regulations are we talking about here, and how do they impact these, heat deals?
So one of the sources you provided mentioned Overwatt, which is the UK's water regulator.
Okay. All right.
They've got these pricing restrictions on water companies, which then impacts any heat deals because, water often plays a part. Yeah, they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Even if a water company's got this gold mine of heat just sitting there, those regulations could really limit what they can actually charge for it.
Wow, so it's like layers on layers here. You've got the legal side of actually owning heat, and then the regulations on top of that. It's definitely a lot for anyone to wrap their heads around, especially if they're thinking, hey, maybe I've got a heat source I can make some money off of.
For sure.
So besides these pricing restrictions, anything else on the regulation front we should flag for people?
Actually, yeah, there's this pretty interesting concept. It's called requirement to connect rules.
Yeah. And
it's basically, it could make it mandatory for some of these heat sources to actually connect to a network.
Wait, hold on. Mandatory. So no more playing hard to get if you're a heat source owner?
Right, exactly.
Wow. Okay, so what would that mean then for those owners?
Well, it could be a game changer. Because if those rules come into play, suddenly the power dynamic shifts. A heat source owner might not have as much leverage if they're thinking, oh, I'm going to charge a premium for my heat because they have to connect anyway.
That's a really good point. Yeah, because we've been talking about this potential for heat sources to generate revenue.
Right.
But these regulations add this whole other dimension. It's not as straightforward as it might seem at first glance.
It really isn't. And I think it just goes to show this is about way more than just the technology.
Yeah.
To make these heat networks work, you need the legal stuff, the regulatory landscape, and then, of course, the actual economics have to make sense.
It's fascinating how it all ties together. Like we started off talking about mining heat from old coal mines, and now we're talking about regulations, power dynamics. It's wild. Really makes you think.
It does. And the thing is, this whole landscape is changing so fast. It's exciting because the stuff that's being figured out now, even if it seems kind of niche, that could be the blueprint for how this whole industry evolves.
Yeah, I'm getting like early days of wind energy vibes from this. It probably seemed pretty out there at the time.
Right.
And now look at it. So you've definitely given me a lot to think about. I got to say, now I'm going to be looking at buildings and wondering about their heat potential. Like, what's going on in there?
That's what we want. We want you to see potential heat sources everywhere.
Right.
It's about changing how we think about energy, and that starts with, well, with awareness.
Exactly. So instead of just like feeling heat, you start to see it as this untapped resource.
Exactly.
Potentially.
Yeah. And imagine, right? One day, your house is hooked up to something like this, or your office building. You're not just using your own heating system, but you're part of this whole closed loop using heat that would have just been wasted otherwise.
That is a very cool thought. Yeah, and it's not just about like individual buildings, right? When you start thinking bigger about the potential impact of this technology, it really gets interesting. Like one thing that really stuck with me from the research was this idea of heat networks as a way to reduce our carbon footprint.
Absolutely. That was a big theme in everything you sent. These networks have huge potential for making heating, especially in cities, way more sustainable. Because, well, think about it. You're not just letting all that heat disappear into thin air. You're capturing it, repurposing it.
Right. So it makes you wonder, could this be a game changer in how we tackle climate change? Like, if it was adopted on a larger scale?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
The potential is definitely there. But, and this is important, it's not like a magic bullet. There are other things to consider.
Okay, like what?
Well, for starters, the cost. Actually getting these networks up and running, that's not cheap. And then there's the whole integration with what we already have, the existing infrastructure. That can be tricky.
Right. It's like any new technology, there are always hurdles.
For sure. But even with those challenges, I really do think it's something to keep our eyes on. As this technology gets even better, who knows what's possible? It'll be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
I'm with you on that. Well, you have definitely given us, and by us I mean everyone listening, a lot to think about today. It's not every day we get to dive into something this, I don't know, multifaceted. I mean, we're talking tech, we're talking legal stuff, regulations, the environment. It's a lot.
It's all connected, though, right? That's what makes it so interesting.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of heat networks. Hopefully everyone listening is now walking around looking at buildings a little differently, maybe feeling a little warmer, knowing about this hidden potential all around us. So until next time, keep those brains buzzing.